All right, welcome to After Treatment Part 2. Hopefully you saw the first video. I would highly recommend it. If you haven't seen it, go to After Treatment Overview Part 1. Definitely want to see that first before we get carried away, because I am going to review a little bit of what I did in Part 1. But in this case, let's get going. What do you say we get going? Hopefully you did. Again, watch Part 1. As you can see from the background of my behind me, you're going to see the dash of a Ford F6, actually a F750. We've had some issues with those two as well. Please note that it is equipped with after treatment. So let's get going into the after treatment. Yes, we did break it up into many different sections for the simple fact it's a lot of meat to chew. So part one was an introduction. We'll make this one quick and painless. In other words, you want to know what's going on. So therefore, we introduced the after treatment. We saw the after treatment, and in this case, you saw the different components. So with that said, you should know the basic components here. So, we mentioned why after treatment, and in this case, the reason why we use after treatment is because of the oxides of nitrogen and particulate matter. Those are the two major emissions we're trying to go after. Again, oxides of nitrogen and particulate matter, aka known as soot. Uh, 2007 was the first generation of the after treatment, which was only diesel oxidation catalyst and diesel particulate filter. Then in 2011, on most vehicles here in the United States, we did see the introduction of SCR, selective catalyst reduction, which we say is using DEF fluid. Those of you on the other side of the world, it is known as AdBlue. So yeah, we call it here SCR. Over there, they call it AdBlue. So therefore, we saw the use of that. So we mentioned that new diesel vehicle owners have encountered issues and messages early on and most related to after treatment. So it is vital that a technician or you as a generic do-it-yourselfer may want to know what a diagnostic trouble code is and the SCR messages and what it all means. So what is the SCR light? Well, there you see it on the left of the screen. That is the symbol that we have here on trucks here in the US. And in this case, we see the message telling us that A, like we said in the first video, we have inadequate NOx reduction, or B, we actually have uh, inadequate NOx, but we haven't been able to test to see if there's adequate NOx reduction. Let me start over. I got confused there. Once again, the light is telling you, one, A, there is inadequate NOx reduction. In other words, it's not reducing NOx. And B, it is actually not confirmed that there is NOx reduction. See, one thing is to measure that NOx levels, and another thing is to say, hey, I am not reducing NOx levels. Now, I went ahead and Googled and to see what the SCR warning light, and in this case, this is their definition that you find on a Google search, because I know a lot of us here are doing Google searches. It says the SCR system is designed to reduce NOx and exhaust gas and purify the exhaust gas by injecting it with AdBlue. When the remaining AdBlue is low, a message is displayed until the multi-information display and the SCR warning light turns on or flashes. And that is if it's running low on DEF fluid. But what about when there's an issue? So what we have seen here is that, we saw the lights and we saw the messages and we defined them in part one. We talked about the SCR light, we talked about the check engine light, and then we saw the exhaust fluid quality poor. However, you're going to see on this truck here that I actually have a threat going on. It's a threat to go to derate. Now, take a look very closely at this picture here, and I'm going to actually zoom it around in the hopes that you better understand what I explained in part one. First of all, let's take a look at the RPM. The truck is idling once again, right? Tell me, do you see a mill light or check engine light? Nope, there's no check engine light. So since there's no check engine light, that means no test has failed. There's no issue that the onboard computer has not found. Now, what we see in the middle is the multiple message window, and it says that the speed of the truck will be limited to 50 miles per hour in 44 miles. And there's your actual light right there, your SCR light. So in this case, it is NOx related. Now, what can I learn from this? Is that what I can learn is that, okay, there's no check engine light, so there's no malfunction or there's no test that has failed. Okay. Now, at that point, I see that there's a threat that he's saying, hey, in 50 miles per hour, I'm going to go ahead and, excuse me, in 45 mile, in 44 miles, I'm going to go ahead and derate you to 50 miles an hour. So this sucks because if you're in a rural area and you got 100 miles to the nearest city, you're going to be derated to 50 miles an hour. That's what people hate about this. And I agree. I could see myself in rural Nevada here. And what's going to happen is that if that should happen on a truck, yeah, I'm going to be derated and it's going to continue to derate. But what we're seeing here is this is a classic example of what techs don't understand or people don't understand. He's saying that there's a problem with the NOx. That's what that light is telling me. But since there is no check engine light, that tells me that he hasn't been able to confirm the reduction of NOx. Now, we're going to introduce briefly the sensors because part 3 will go into the sensors. But there is a pre and post NOx sensor. So there are 2 NOx sensors. Now, just to give you a little bit of advanced information, the NOx sensor is also an oxygen sensor. Actually, really, it's an oxygen sensor, but we call them NOx sensors. So don't get all bent out of shape, okay? NOx sensors. So there is a NOx sensor somewhere right behind the turbo on the exhaust side. And then somewhere after the SER, there's going to be another NOx sensor. So there's a pre and post NOx sensor. Okay, so the pre and post NOx sensor measure the NOx levels before the SER and after the SER to see if there is indeed a reduction in NOx. Okay, so we're measuring NOx levels before and after, and that is in parts per million. So what he's saying here, what I can now assimilate from this screen is that, hey, the speed is limited to 50 miles an hour and 44 miles. So what he's saying with that light, with no check engine light, I can now say, hey, there's no check engine light. Okay. There's no test that has failed. Nothing's wrong, except that he hasn't been able to verify NOx reduction. So you're probably scratching your head going, well, Tony, this thing's running. It should be at operating temperature. Look at the gauges on the top. You're right. But in the eyes of the computer, he hasn't met those conditions to verify NOx reduction, which, knowing from experience, it probably means that the truck's been running too cold or in too cold of an environment. That's my guess. But in this case, the conditions have not been there for the computer. I don't care what you think. This is where techs say, well, I could see on the scan tool that the NOx levels are dropping. Why is it threatening to derate? Well, who cares what you think? It's what the computer programmed. There's something in the program that I couldn't even tell you that he's seen that has not yet met the conditions for him to say, hey, I'm going to check the NOx levels to see if there is a reduction in NOx, NOx. So that's what we're saying here. So here's a good example of what I was saying earlier in part 1. Okay. Now I'll give you the answer later on in part 3, but in this case, it definitely needs to get warmed up, driven hard. But I know what you're saying, Tony. I only got 44 miles, and I've gotten technical calls on my cell phone where technicians are telling me, hey, I see this threat, and the thing is, I can't seem to figure out why it's not threatening, stop the threat before it goes into derate, or if it's in derate. So this is a classic example of why diesels get a bad rap, because it is saying per law that, hey, I haven't been able to measure and confirm NOx reduction. That doesn't mean it's a problem. Okay, hopefully you're getting this. There's no check engine light once again, right? That means there's no diagnostic turbo code set. And just to step back for a second, the check engine light or the mill light, like we said in part 1, is a law light. In other words, it's mandated by law. And it comes back to OBD2. OBD2 is Onboard Diagnostics Generation 2, which was brought back by the Clean Air Act, by the government. And it's clearly stated that if emissions exceed 1.5 times over the federal test procedures, if emissions exceed over those procedures, the check engine light or malfunction indicator lamp must illuminate. So in this case, there must be a failure code set, and there also must be, again, a light on, but there's no light on. Okay, so that means there's no emission failure. There is no failure. Again, this message is telling me that since there's no check engine light, that he hasn't be able to confirm that there is adequate NOx reduction. So I'm going round and round on this. Hopefully you're getting it. Inadequate NOx reduction there, and that's what we're seeing there. So, all right. So as we continue on, we talked about the DPF. It's collect and trap the suit. We talked about SCR briefly. We haven't gone in depth into SCR, but it is injecting the DEF fluid, which converts to what? Anybody remember in part 1? It converts to what? Ammonia, NH3. And then we got a diesel oxidation catalyst, which we say works with fuel to create a hellacious amount of heat. So it's a chemical reaction. And then we got the ammonia slip catalyst, which we'll talk in maybe a part 3 or part 4 of this about how we're trapping the ammonia that's generated. So remember, as we're basically talking about SER, there is injection of DEF fluid into the exhaust, and it's actually going ahead and converting to ammonia from the chemical reaction with the exhaust, and that ammonia is what breaks up the NOx. So there you go. Now, we introduced the after treatment earlier on in part 1. We said that there is only a diesel particulate filter, which is this guy right here, and then we got an oxidation catalyst. What we didn't talk about is the sensors we see here. This is a plain Jane simple Duramax LMM 2007 to 2010 GM truck. And what we are seeing here is there's your downpipe coming off the turbo. And there we could see our first component was our diesel oxidation catalyst. And then we got our diesel particulate filter. What we're going to see is a tube, which they're calling the pressure sample line 2, pressure sample line 1, and that's going to a delta pressure sensor, aka known as our pressure differential or DPS sensor. All he's doing is measuring the pressure difference between the inlet and the outlet, right here, the outlet, inlet versus outlet of the particulate filter. So the way a computer monitors whether or not a DPF is getting loaded with soot or getting restricted with soot, it's going to go ahead and measure that pressure difference. So on the scan, to which I'll show you here towards the end, we can read the PSI. Here in the United States is pounds per square inch. We're going to read the PSI level. Some scan tools will leave it in pascals, kilopascals. You can read that pressure. But in this case, we can see the pressure variance. So I guess the first basic trivia question we could ask is, how does the computer know that the DPF is going to require cleaning or regeneration? And that is by using the delta pressure sensor. There's a pressure differential sensor. Some pressure differential sensors are just one tube right before it, and then it's just using atmospheric pressure as a reference on the other side, because again, it's a pressure differential sensor. It's measuring the pressure difference between the inlet and the outlet, which the outlet should be exposed to atmospheric pressure anyway. So in this case, it's going to measure that difference. So if it starts to go to 1 psi, 2 psi, 3 psi, that means it's starting to get loaded as we read it on a scan tool. Okay. Now, the other thing we're going to see is, again, a temperature sensor. As we talked about, heat is very important. We mentioned light off in part 1. So in this case, we're looking at, again, a temperature sensor. And this is a basic one. We got basically one, and we should have another one before. So basically 2 sensors you're going to see there. Now, to give you a better understanding of the realities we deal as a shop, is that here's an example of an '09 Power Stroke 6.4. This was an F-250, and in this case, the vehicle was towed in, not running at all, and it just would not start. It acted like it wanted to start, but it wouldn't start. So there was no exhaust flow. And as you can see in the picture, I don't know if you can see it very well, it had some carbon accumulation on the inlet of the diesel oxidation catalyst. So one of the procedures we tell technicians when they're diagnosing trucks is, if you got a sluggish problem, lack of power problem, or maybe come to the point that you checked everything and you still can't figure out why it don't start, maybe it's time to uncork the exhaust. What do I mean by uncork the exhaust? Well, on most downpipes, on most downpipes, you're going to see a flange right there. Here you can see a downpipe come from the turbo. This is a flange right there. We can literally disconnect, take the bolts off or nuts off, and go ahead and just separate just enough for us to, again, disconnect, just separate them just slightly. And I'm going to fire up the truck. And what I want to do is, A, does the truck run? And B, is there any smoke or oil or coolant coming out of that downpipe? Because it could be inside of there, but you can't see it physically because, again, it's all within the whole exhaust system. So we uncorked the exhaust and the engine started. Okay. So definitely the diesel particulate filter was mega loaded. It was just clogged to the core. But once we got the truck running and tried to drive it uncorked, with the flanges disconnected, just hanging there was no boost. So we looked at the visually, like I told you, you want to look at the exhaust tailpipe. Here you can see the exhaust pipe, the coolers as we call them, and obviously you can see how blackened they were. So if the diesel particulate filter is supposed to trap the soot, right? What that means is that if there is soot coming out of the tailpipe, right, their exhaust tips or the coolers, that means the channel has been damaged in that filter. It's allowing soot to go by. So with that said, we knew we had a DPF problem here, okay, because we see heavy accumulation. So as a diagnostic tip, if your truck is equipped with a particulate filter and you actually have massive soot accumulation on the tips, that pretty much tells you that the channel or something is not trapping the soot within the diesel particulate filter. So the other thing we also mention is when you're doing drivability checks, you got sluggish, lack of power, and you're not sure if the after treatment system is restricted, simply just uncork it. On most trucks here in the US, we are able to, again, uncork very ever so slightly and able to run the truck to see what's going on. Not to mention to see what kind of smoke is coming out. There should be no smoke. I mean, do I have black smoke? Do I have white smoke? Do I have blue smoke coming down? That's going to lead to premature clogging of that after treatment system. Okay. So after doing some diagnostics and talking to the customer, we had no power, no boost. We took the turbo off, and boy, was it grenaded. In this case, you can see the chunks of metal right there that came apart from the variable vanes inside that turbo. So this turbo had just grenaded, which tells me that this turbo saw some hellacious amount of heat, a lot of heat. So obviously, the big bill came in now the turbos needed to be replaced. But after putting the turbos in, there's always that question is, what started this whole thing? In other words, why did this all clog up? Well, this is a drivability class. So, I mean, this is an after treatment, not a drivability. But I'll quickly tell you, we attached the smoke machine, and we'll talk about smoke machines later. And what we did is smoke up the intake. Yes, there are machines they sell that for us technicians or shops or whoever wants to buy them that actually put smoke into the intake. Here's my adapter right here. And if you want me to zoom it, I'll zoom it up a little bit. And what we do is, there we go. And in this case, you see the adapter right here that I put on the tube from the air filter. And what I just simply did is we attached smoke machine and we smoked it up. And right off the bat, we could see the smoke right there that is just leaking. It's what we call unmetered air. In other words, since the boot was broken, the mass airflow sensor was not reading correctly. So therefore, in essence, we suspect that the truck was overfueling. And since it was overfueling, it was actually creating massive more soot, more issues, which in turn clogged the DPF. So we had to replace that intake boot there too as well. So in turn, to repair this truck, we sent out the whole after treatment system to a cleaner. Yes, we have local people here that actually provide DPF, DOC, SER cleaning. The reason why we like ours is because he uses ultrasonic cleaning. Most places do what we call a baking or oven, or they have a blower they put these adapters on. So if you want to search on Google, look up DPF cleaning or DOC cleaning, you'll be able to see that. We obviously changed the oil, replaced the turbos, so that alone was a hefty price, easy over $4,000, not to mention the labor. Obviously, we checked the rest of the system, and we had 4 injectors out of range, so the customer was pretty much tapped out on money. So we warned them that those injectors were also out of range on their fuel trim, so he had more to diagnose or to repair, possibly 4 injectors. Okay, so in other words, we weren't out of the woods yet, but you can only sell what you're going to sell. But this is a classic example of what caused it. We saw the DPF clog, we got lucky. It was able to be cleaned. If not, we didn't have to replace it, but it was able to be cleaned. And at that point, we changed the oil because the oil was cooked up because this truck had been through massive heat and the turbos were replaced. And then we sent her down the road. So, but again, with a fair warning that we had 4 injectors. So you could see that this bill could easily have gone into the $6,000 range, and it's kind of sad because the truck's probably worth no more than 12. So there you go. So we mentioned already about the after treatments. Was another quick review of what we said in part one. There's our oxidation catalyst on this. This is a Power Stroke 6.7. We were looking at a 6.4 earlier. And in this case, here's our DEF fluid AdBlue injector right there. Again, there's our tank. And there you could see the SCR and diesel particulate filter. So when you remove this, you literally are taking this whole assembly. Here's your flange right here. And there's got to be a flange in the front here. And in this case, we literally, to send it clean and take this whole assembly out, and they pick it up or we take it to them and they clean it. But they charge us by the weld because they literally have to cut. So if I want to clean this DPF, they're going to have to cut right here, and then they're going to re-weld it after they get done cleaning. So therefore, that's a way that the new ones are now done because there's no longer flanges between the components like we saw back in the early years of 2007 to 2010 model years. Okay, so that's what we're seeing right there. But when we look at, here is the Ram Dodge diagram here. And in this case, what you're going to see here, Ram Dodge on the Dodge trucks with the 6.7 Cummins, we're going to see, here's the turbo symbol. There's your diesel oxidation catalyst. There's your diesel particulate filter. And then there's your SER catalyst to reduce the NOx. However, you're going to see the ASC, which is the ammonia slip catalyst. This is unique to this brand because General Motors and Ford product on the light duty truck size that I deal with, guess what? They're not using an ASC except Ram Dodge trucks. Okay. Now, to get you more advanced learning here, since we're introducing a little bit of sensors, there's your exhaust gas temperature sensor 1, another exhaust gas temperature sensor 2, exhaust gas temperature 3, and 4 and 5. So unlike the previous '07 model, here you can look at a 2012, 2013 Ram truck, and it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 temperature sensors to know what the temperature of the exhaust is at very different points of this whole after treatment system. And then you got NOx right here, which means we got a NOx sensor here. That's before the whole assembly, and a NOx sensor after is what we call the pre and post NOx sensors. And that's what you're looking at there. Okay, so remember, NH3 is what? Is ammonia. So therefore, we have ammonia present here. That's why they put it there. So that ammonia is breaking up the NOx, but any excess ammonia left over is absorbed by the ammonia slip catalyst. And there's more to the story there, but we'll just stop there. Okay. But before we get too far ahead and get into SCR, which we'll do later on in a part 3 and part 4, please note, that we got regeneration. So we talked about the particulate filter. We talked about the SCR catalyst and the DPF and DOC, all that good stuff. But let's first talk about regeneration. Regeneration is defined, okay, as the process of burning the soot. So on most systems, we see a diesel oxidation catalyst. That diesel oxidation catalyst may create hellacious amount of heat to not only warm the NOx or SCR catalyst, but also to burn, as it says right here, to clean up and burn the soot that's accumulated in the diesel particulate filter. Okay, so therefore, remember, the burnt soot can create ash, but there's oil substances there that also can create ash too. So a DPF eventually can become ash loaded. So what determines the life of a particulate filter, and only the particulate filter, is when it becomes ash loaded. So when it becomes ash loaded, that means that it has to be replaced or it has to be sent out for cleaning, like I just told you earlier. Okay. So again, where the regeneration is the process of burning the soot. So therefore, what are the 3 types of regeneration? There is manual regeneration, which we as technicians can do with a scan tool, and we can command a regeneration. I'll show that later on future videos, how I can do on a Ford, for example, but I'll show you some pictures here. There's active regeneration and there's passive regeneration. So active means that the computer is going to inject fuel into that exhaust facing that oxidation catalyst to get a chemical reaction to occur, which will create that hellacious amount of heat. I mentioned this already. So therefore, we got to find a way to inject the fuel into that exhaust before the diesel oxidation catalyst. So if you look at a Duramax on an LML and an L5P, which is pretty much 2011 and on, they use a dedicated injector. So in the exhaust stream somewhere, there is another injector, which we call the hydrocarbon injector. And that will inject fuel into the exhaust. It's a low pressure injector. It ain't like the common rail, but it's an injector that injects fuel into the exhaust. So the computer on a Duramax will command that injector to inject fuel on an active regeneration. But on other trucks like the Powerstroke 6.7 and the Cummins 6.7, what those do is they do what we call post-injection. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. As we know, the 4 strokes of an engine as that piston goes up and down. Well, on the exhaust stroke, the injector is going to inject fuel. So at that point, when the exhaust valve is open and the piston comes up towards top dead center, it's going to push that fuel-rich exhaust. Did you hear me correctly? That fuel-rich exhaust into the exhaust itself. So therefore, in the exhaust stroke, it's going to, again, send that fuel out into the exhaust manifold, out to the turbos, and eventually get to the diesel oxidation catalyst. That sucks. Quote me here. Yes, it's terrible. post injections are a bad thing because you're literally spitting fuel into that combustion chamber, into that cylinder, and that in turn is actually being pushed out into the exhaust. I'll talk more about that later on. But in this case, there's a lot of subjects to talk about, right? So, but in this case, we see that happening. So that is active regeneration. So when I command with the scan tool and I turn and do a regeneration, yes, I'm running post injections if it's that kind of vehicle or a dedicated injector, depending what kind of vehicle I'm working on. So the third type of regeneration is the ideal one, as you can see on this slide. It is passive. That's why the over-the-road loaded truck is the ideal truck. We got these guys called hotshot drivers here. These hot drivers drive these light-duty, medium-duty trucks, and they haul loads. So if it's always loaded, that means that heat from that engine working hard is actually going to generate enough heat to burn off the soot. So there's no fuel assistance of any kind. And that is the ideal way. So that's why, again, the over-the-road truck is the ideal for passive regeneration. So that's a good thing, where the heat is hot enough in the exhaust, which in turn will burn off the soot in the DPF. So why would service information procedures direct the technician to run a regeneration? Let's say I get an EGR flow code or a mass airflow code because maybe the airflow is being affected by restricted exhaust. Or maybe the flow of the EGR gases aren't flowing wet because I got too much back pressure because I got a restricted exhaust due to a restricted DPF. So yeah, so many times as technicians, they're supposed to run a regeneration provided that the engine runs fine. So again, we got to reach those light off temperatures. And like I said on the part one, we have to reach at least 592 degrees. Now, SER for NOx conversion and creating the ammonia, we also need heat too as well. So like I said in part one, heat is needed in these after treatment systems. So let's take a look here. Here you could see an old Tech 2 reading from a Tech 2 GM scan tool, but I like it because it's basic. Here you can see the exhaust gas temperature, and we saw this early model on the previous diagram that it has only 2 temperature sensors. So there we can see exhaust gas temperature sensor 1, exhaust gas temperature sensor 2. But then we could see our pressure differential or our particulate filter pressure. So again, we can read that pressure to know if it's loaded. So in this case, we are able to see that. So we see the temperature before and the temperature after. Later on, I'll talk about how we interpret these readings, but we can read that on the scan tool when we run a regeneration to see what's going on. So what happens if a truck does too many regenerations? For example, the 6.4 Power Stroke is notorious for getting diluted oil. Yes, it's a very popular thing. So one of the things I recommend to 6.4 Power Stroke owners, which was 2007 and a half to 2010 that they were using the 6.7. And in this case, I tell them, check the oil, check the oil. Got it religiously about check the oil. Why? Because if too many post injections are occurring, inject fuel, inject fuel, inject fuel, eventually some of that fuel is going to go around the rings and dilute the oil. Okay, so that's the problem with post injections. If done too frequently, you're going to dilute the oil. So it isn't surprising when you check the oil that it's about 1, 2, 3. Hell, I've seen it over 5 quarts. 5 quarts of oil over. So that's a huge level, which starts to destruct the engine because now the oil's diluted, viscosity went out the damn door, lubricity went out the door, and now you start to see catastrophic failures, rocker arm failures, turbo issues, lower end issues. The list goes on because of poor lubricity, because the oil is so diluted with diesel fuel because of frequent regenerations. So the question begs, why did this happen? Because there was obviously a malfunction that was loading up the DPF. Because why would the computer want to run more regenerations? Because there's something malfunctioning that's causing too much soot accumulation or fooling the computer that there's too much soot accumulation in the DPF. So in essence, there was something mechanically wrong with the engine, either a leaky injector, turbo boost issues, and the list goes on. So that's a good example of, regenerating too much. So as we finish up this section here, we got sensors. Okay, there's got to be sensors. So therefore, if we look at the sensors, you can see there's a slew of sensors. And boy, do you talk about money with sensors. A lot of money in sensors. We see NOx sensors. Those are the number twos. And then we look at temperature sensors. Again, this is a General Motors product we're now looking at. In this case, we have temperature sensors. we got the oxidation catalyst, So I'm not even going to look right here. I'm just going to tell you what they are. Let me backtrack so you can see what I'm saying. I pretty much know them pretty good. In this case, number ones, let's see, I got, here we could see our number 13. Let's start off with this guy right here. Number 13 is coming from this. This must be my DEF fluid AdBlue tank. So this must be the reductant injector, which means that this number 4 must be my SER catalyst or NOx reducing brick. Then number 5, that must be my diesel particulate filter, while number 3 is my diesel oxidation catalyst. So let's flow through here. Here we go down the downpipe. Diesel oxidation catalyst, SER catalyst, diesel particulate filter. Sensors. We see number 1 here, and we see a number 1 here. So this is my pre-NOx sensor, and this is my post-NOx sensor. The number 2s, well, those got to be temperature sensors. Temperature sensor 1, temperature sensor 2, temperature sensor 3, right? And then over here we got temperature sensor 4, right? Since our particulate filter is number 5, this must be our differential pressure sensor, because we got to see the pressure difference to see if the particulate filter is getting clogged. There you go. So that's what we're looking at there. Okay. Now, this guy, number 14, that must be my hydrocarbon injector. That is the fuel injector for the exhaust. Again, it's a low pressure injector, and it's injecting fuel on this model. So I know this is a Duramax because neither Ford or Ram Dodge use this. So Duramax does have a hydrocarbon injector. Since it's a V8 engine, we call it the 9th injector as well. But again, it is not a high pressure injector. It's a low pressure injector. And that again allows fuel to chemically react with the diesel oxidation catalyst, create a hellacious amount of heat, and that will in turn heat the SER catalyst and burn off the soot in the DPF. So there you go. So there's a lot going on. Now within the actual tank of the DEF fluid or AdBlue, we're going to have some type of reverting valve. We got a pump. We got heaters because since it's mostly water, the DEF fluid or the AdBlue, it could freeze. So there's got to be heater and there's got to be various sensors located within this setup right here. So there you go. Okay. So in turn, please remember, and this is where we're going to end it here for part 2, is that you got to understand that we're going to be injecting DEF fluid into that exhaust. What I will talk about next in part 3 will be about how this all works. So let's just quickly look at this picture to finish up here to introduce that. Is we see an injector, which we call the doser, okay, or DEF fluid injector, whatever you want to call it, but doser reductant injector. It's got many names depending on the manufacturer, but it's injecting the DEF fluid. Now, like I said already, that DEF fluid or AdBlue must readily convert into ammonia. So therefore, it must spray it in a fine mist. So there's got to be a volume specification, and there must be also a visual check that you will do with the scan tool, because you're literally going to unhook it and you're going to get a graduated cylinder, a measuring device to measure the volume to see if it sprays. And then we're going to test the quality of that DEF fluid or AdBlue to see if it's good DEF fluid. Because yes, there are drivers that are putting water in these tanks, and there is expired DEF fluid AdBlue that's being sold as well. So with that said, DEF fluid is injected. It readily converts almost within microseconds. It converts to ammonia, and it is the ammonia that breaks up the NOx. So if there's inadequate NOx reduction, it could be maybe I got a clogged reductant injector doser, or I can have poor quality DEF fluid, or it's just not hot enough. It's too cold. All right, so that's it. Hopefully you're learning. Please feel free to rewind. If you got any more questions, let me know in the comments section. If you're new to this and you're learning, subscribe, say hello, make any comment. Until then, we'll see you in part 2. Thank you for watching.